the decade of the brain came and everyone was like, oh, okay, we're going to finally discover the simple brain regions which are causing these problems, and never really finding it. It's always been more complicated than we hoped. But I think everyone kind of knows now that psychiatry is in a bit of a mess, that these disorders are not as clean cut as we make them out to be, especially with this sort of maybe diagnostic expansion in the last 5-10 years. And I think linking the evolutionary framework to all these findings and kind of making sense of them all under the theory which explains all biological variation, the way that we explain jealousy and love and eyes and everything, hunger, it's like everything needs some sort of evolutionary explanation at some level. And the reasons why people don't think about it enough is that people don't think about disease in that framework.
Welcome back. As many people know, psychiatry is dealing with a lot of different problems at the moment. Problems like, why are mental health disorders so common? Why can they be so difficult to treat? What causes different mental health conditions? Why are people so different, and why do we have such different personalities? One of the areas of research which is starting to help us understand these problems is the field of evolutionary psychiatry. We've made a few episodes about evolutionary psychiatry as it can be applied to different conditions before, including interviews with people like Dr. Andy Nesse and Dr. Henry O'Connell. Today we're in conversation with Dr. Adam Hunt, PhD. Adam has been working in the field of evolutionary psychiatry since 2016. He's a postdoc researcher at the University of Cambridge, and he is the host of the Evolving Psychiatry podcast, which provides interviews, insights, and an introduction to evolutionary psychiatry with guest appearances from leading academics and psychiatrists. He's working on an upcoming book, Specialised Minds, which seeks to explain the existence of long-term common mental health disorders and common personality traits as products of the evolutionary process, specifically of something called cognitive specialization. Today, I speak with Adam on a range of topics, including the usefulness of evolutionary psychiatry and how it can help us begin to answer so many of the questions which plague psychiatry. We discuss why humans have such specialized minds and how this could help us understand neurodiversity, such as autism and ADHD. We discuss why we gossip, how a personality trait is a strength and a weakness at the same time, how an understanding of evolutionary psychiatry can help doctors talk to patients in a way that can enhance their awareness and help them to change their lives, some of the limitations of the field at the moment, and the future of evolutionary psychiatry looking forward. This is the Thinking Mind podcast, a podcast all about psychiatry, psychology, therapy, and related topics. As always, thank you for listening. And now here's today's conversation with Dr. Adam Hunt. Adam, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you so much, Alex, for having me.
What do you wish more people would understand about evolutionary psychology or psychiatry?
I think the main thing is that it's complementary to other approaches. I think there's maybe a tendency in psychiatry to kind of take a brain-based approach or talk about the genetics or talk about environmental factors which lead to whatever the disorder is. And then when you start hearing about evolutionary psychiatry, you might think, oh, well, what's this alternative? And that's absolutely not what we're doing. What the evolutionary kind of approach and what evolutionary theory explains is sort of everything. It's you need to explain why brains end up in these particular types of states and having these particular types of forms and receptors rather than others. You need to explain why these environmental impacts of, for instance, stress, why do they cause these particular types of reaction? We're not trying to provide something that's combating or refuting or can be refuted by kind of genetic studies or neuroscientific studies. If you look inside the brain and you see, oh, there's this slight difference which is causing whatever, schizophrenia or depression, okay, that's fine. But why is the big question. It's this ultimate why question, which I think is so fascinating. And it's also something that really isn't being well addressed by the current psychiatric paradigm. And mental disorders, more than physical disorders, are paradoxical from an evolutionary perspective. Most kind of bodily illnesses arise late in life, you're 60, 70, 80, you start aging, you start becoming decrepit and developing more susceptibility to cancer and heart disease and everything. And the weird thing about mental illness is that it arises at the peak of reproductive potential, like adolescence, when you're meant to be kind of finding your place in the world and, fitting in and finding a mate, impressing people. It's very strange for a disorder, a kind of simple illness, to arise at that specific age, particularly, before your 20s. So there's this big paradox. Why do mental health conditions arise so early, but also so common? They are often long-lasting, and the prevalence of them is high enough that we would expect most of our ancestors to have known people who are on the autism spectrum or on the ADHD spectrum. So this is kind of an extra question, which is not being answered if you just find the genes which are predisposing you to autism. You then have to keep asking, well, why do these genes persist? Why haven't they been selected out? And that's something that I think really appealed to me about the evolutionary perspective, and I think gives a lot of insight into why we've been so confused about exactly what these conditions are, and we've been looking for simple pathology and never really finding it. It's always been more complicated than we hoped. The decade of the brain came and everyone was like, oh, okay, we're going to finally discover the simple brain regions which are causing these problems. And that just didn't happen. It's just complicated, messy, it's dimensional. And then the same with genetics. As soon as we were like, okay, finally we can look inside the human genome and we're going to find these specific genes which are predisposing people to schizophrenia. And it just hasn't worked out like that. The genes are much smaller effect than we predicted. They're much more common in the population. They're older. So, and these fields have sort of been forwarded with, good intention to try and find pathology, but that's just not what they found. And I think linking the evolutionary framework to all these findings and kind of making sense of them all under the theory which explains all biological variation. After all, it's the way that we explain jealousy and love and eyes and everything, hunger. It's like everything needs some sort of evolutionary explanation at some level. And I think one of the misconceptions or the reasons why people don't think about it enough is that people don't think about disease in that framework. This is certainly the case for me. Everyone hears about mental illness, and a lot of people hear about evolutionary psychology or evolutionary theory explaining, why we are the way we are. And it's not put to you that mental illness is something that needs explanation within the realm of evolutionary theory. You just assume, okay, it's a breakage. It doesn't matter. We explain the good things, we explain the adaptations, but mental illness is not that. And that's the assumption that you can live with for your whole life and keep looking for the pathology and it's never there. But then when you really ask the question of why these traits persisted, why are they so common in early onset, then you are brought to this evolutionary paradox, which I think justifies the field and is something that I'm really interested in exploring in my work and encouraging other people to explore as well.
And I myself noticed in my psychiatry training, there was a stark lack of explanation for how lots of different mental processes come to be. For example, our emotional systems. Why do we feel happy? Why do we feel sad? Why do we feel angry? What are the functions of all of these systems? And then if you understand that, then perhaps you might be able to go on to explain why you get extremes of these systems, why anger can become perhaps antisocial behavior, why sadness could potentially become depression. We could perhaps go on to talk about it. The other thing I thought in listening to your logic and your line of reasoning, which makes a lot of sense to me, is even very common physical health problems like obesity, metabolic problems, diabetes, etc. We're currently mostly think of them in the same disease framework. Something's just going wrong with the body. But using your same reasoning, why is it so common? Why is it happening to people at a young age? We have children now who are commonly diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. And evolutionary thinking, specifically the idea of evolutionary mismatch, can really help us understand this a lot better. Like, hey, our physiology, our bodies were designed for a certain environment. Sugar, fat, salt, that was like really rare in our evolutionary landscape. So we're going to be predisposed to crave it. Now we're in a landscape where we can get literally as much of it as we want. So of course you're going to see diabetes, obesity as a consequence of that. And that really helps. I think using that concrete physical health example really helps us land just how helpful this kind of approach can be.
Right. We're living in a sort of obesogenic environment, and we might be living in a depressogenic environment as well. Like, there are so many aspects of our current social environment which are really strange. You know, we don't have a constant community around us who are kind of giving us feedback of you know, that we're accepted, giving us direction about what to do every day, like providing a kind of a life which is very sort of transient and immediate and really needs your attention. And there's no such thing as a goal for, you know, 2 years time, because you can think forward maybe a few months, because sometimes, you know, you're caring for your fields or you're gardening a little bit, or you've got animals and you want to raise the animals. But most of life is just so immediate, and you have so much stimulation in a kind of very active way that, like, yeah, you can see why so much has changed. And this kind of innate, so just, you know, building fat was obviously useful and for surviving times when you lose food, and low mood was probably almost certainly, you know, very useful for times when you needed to, you know, hunker down. Like, it's a really resource poor environment. Maybe you're suffering bullying, and actually the best thing to do is just kind of retreat from life, stay away from other people, you know. And one of the things that might happen then is that you would get social support, because people would see that you're not interacting with, or you're not producing in the way that you're kind of needed to. So one of the things that I've been doing in the last 5 years or so is trying to build interest from evolutionary anthropologists who actually go and work with tribespeople around the world to study what's happening with the mental health in these populations. Because surprisingly to me, after working this for almost 10 years, like, there's very few people who've really tried to find, you know, the people with autism or schizophrenia or the depression.
Which is the biggest criticism of the field, right? That there isn't that much evidence.
Yeah.
Or it's hard to get evidence, I should say.
It is hard to get it. I mean, we can never look back in time. We can never actually observe what happened for the hundreds of thousands of years which have shaped our minds. But we can look around the world today and look at people living in very distinctly different environments from our own that are much closer to what our ancestors would have been living like, and see, well, you know, what happens to a state of depression. And anthropologists are interested in this. It's a very complicated question, because I was optimistically naive going into this, thinking, all I have to do is take a questionnaire, convert it to the local language. But it's so hard, because these questionnaires, if you read, you know, the autism quotient, it's sort of asking you, do you prefer spending time in the library? And what's the hunter-gatherer equivalent to that, right? And even like spending time alone, like if you're kind of on the autism spectrum, like, but you can't actually spend time alone really as a hunter-gatherer anyway, but maybe you're just like a little bit more subdued and you're not like interacting as fluidly socially, and you're kind of sitting on the edge of the group. But these are such hard things to pick up, especially if you're coming from a culture which is very different. And you know, we weren't noticing autism in our own society for the last, 30 years ago, we were diagnosing much less autism, and now we're saying, okay, well, here are these differences. Going to a tribe and trying to ask the same question is also very messy. But yes, in talking to anthropologists, almost all of them do have some sorts of anecdotes of when they were living with the tribes. You know, like one that comes to mind is a guy who worked with the Hadza, a tribe in East Africa, and he noticed that there was this woman who developed, basically it looked like a state of quite severe depression. And it was very obvious to the people around her, because she was unable to care for her children, and she was unable to get up and hunt and gather every day, which is like the only thing that really matters is, are you, able to get up and just go and gather and care for your kids? And it's super important for everyone in her community, like her family and also her friends, people that she lives with, the adults that she lives with, that she's up and being productive as well, because otherwise they have to feed her kids. And And so it's a huge cost. And so, when she entered this state of depression, which I think they had some word for it, which it was kind of related to sickness, but they recognized this is not a classic physical sickness. You can see when someone has a fever, is infected with something. And they kind of knew this was more of a soul sickness type of thing. And so they went to her and they tried to work out what was going on. And it turns out that her husband had basically disappeared with another woman. And this depression state had kind of arisen quite quickly after he just hadn't come back for a few days. So this was basically a prompt for everyone to get together and chase down the husband, bring him back and say, look, your wife is not caring for her kids. They're going to starve. We can't allow this. We're all feeding them. You have to come back. So he came back and they did a healing ceremony, and everyone kind of stands around and he had to make a sacrifice or something like that. And she was fine. She kind of got up and, the next day and she's working again. And it's like an interesting example for a couple of reasons. One is that it hits home how important it is to not be depressed in these environments. I think maybe we think of depression as like a common disorder. So maybe it's not as severe as schizophrenia or autism or whatever. Just not getting out of bed for a day is hugely important for a group who are constantly needing to get up and hunt and get it. Like, we can have a full-fledged depressed people in our own society can basically hide in a bedroom for weeks at end and order food online or whatever it is, or just not eat that much, and it doesn't really matter, and people don't notice because they don't have 6 kids who they're having to feed every day, and the way to feed them is to get up and literally dig roots out of the ground. So I think that there's a couple of elements of our own society which kind of allow these depressed states to, become kind of catastrophic and persistent, which is that, people kind of don't notice. Like, it's possible to just be depressed for days, weeks on end. And therefore you don't have the kind of the intervention which might be necessary. But also you're going to, by being depressed, you're actually going to end up in maybe a more depressing situation because maybe you do lose your job. Maybe you can't, find a relationship. And so I think it's a very clear case of, a tendency for low mood and even, possibly quite severe low mood that should be resolved. But because we're living in a weird environment, it just doesn't.
I think that's a huge point, and I don't think it's one I've ever quite thought of before, that in something like a hunter-gatherer society, low mood, perhaps mild depression can serve this function to get other people's attention, to signal to other people that things aren't quite okay. Yes, to also allow you to rest and recuperate. But now in our modern environment, it allows depression to persist and to get into a catastrophic positive feedback loop. And actually no one's noticing. And the thing about mental disorders is very often they are invisible illnesses, severe depression, but also schizophrenia, things like that. Many people have literally, unless you have a friend or a family member who's experiencing it, have no experience of what it's like to encounter someone's mentally ill. I think that's a really interesting point. I'm curious, how did you initially become interested in the field? I know you studied philosophy before moving into evolutionary psychiatry, and how did this become your field?
Yeah, back in 2010, I did an undergrad in philosophy, and then in 2013, I did a master's at Bristol. So that was really the start. I liked truth. I liked, understanding deep fundamental truths about the universe. But if you do philosophy for long enough, you realize, this is actually kind of going in circles and it's word games, and actually science is sort of actually the way that we've worked out how to discover truth. So I went to Bristol because Bristol has a master's which is very specifically philosophy of science. So I did philosophy of physics, philosophy of biology, and philosophy of psychology there. So for people who don't know what the philosophy of biology is like, or philosophy of psychology, it's sort of, to me, it's the fun bit of the theory. Like, rather than running the experiments, you look over what the field has been trying to do, the core findings, and then also where the theory is sort of not adding up. So in philosophy of biology, most relevantly, you mostly think about evolutionary theory and some of the complexities of evolutionary theory and how it works. And I was like, this is the kind of level of why I was sort of more looking for. Because a lot of psychology is just describing what's going on in the mind, and it's very messy because you're not actually hitting anything objective. And we say that thoughts follow feelings, follow behavior, and it's like, but how do really parse this out. And it seems so messy to me. Psychology is it's a very difficult thing to grasp, even though it's so intimately obvious to us that what conscious processes are. Yeah, it was sort of lacking something. But the evolutionary approach, I was like, wow, this is super cool. So one of the things that I took away from that was like, okay, well, this is the way to understand mental traits and, the fundamental explanation. Yes, but no one mentioned disorder. And then I kind of stopped. I finished my master's and I was like, okay, well, what am I going to do? And I came across basically this paradox, specifically in the context of schizophrenia, which is, so extreme and so harmful, but it's still so common. I was just absolutely stunned by this recognition that that we haven't been able to find the pathology, and it's really an evolutionary paradox. And like, is evolution not working here? What's happening? And I suppose the other thing that really hit me was the fact that no one seems to be talking about this. Like, I'd never heard of evolutionary psychiatry. All of the information I was getting about mental disorder and mental health was sort of, it's kind of, it's from Hollywood and it's from newspapers, and it's like whispers amongst your family about, someone over here who, this daughter is experiencing this, or, oh, that's this aunt who'd had this happen. But you don't really understand what's going on, and it's sort of under the table. As you were saying, most people don't really know what schizophrenia looks like, and I think it's weird how little conversation there is about these traits. Maybe that's changing now. So I think that just bringing these things together and realizing that the evolutionary theory had to explain something. It had to explain the vulnerability, or why these traits persist, or what's the adaptive module that's going wrong here. And I was frankly like, I couldn't believe how few people were working in it. This was 2016, and the Royal College of Psychiatrists were just setting up, I didn't know this at the time, but they were just setting up a group, the Evolutionary Psychiatry Special Interest Group, which I can encourage anyone to join. It's free to join their mailing list, and you'll get informed of all of the events in evolutionary psychiatry. That's really the kind of hub, the global hub, frankly, for researchers and clinicians who are interested in the field. But it was 2016 and they were just starting up, and so I didn't really know what to do. And I talked to my professor about it, Samir Akasha. I kind of had these ideas about, how selection might have maintained the variation in the population. And he was, this is really interesting, but this isn't like something not something I'm doing as a research study. So you should go try and find like an evolutionary psychologist. So then I approached evolutionary psychologists, and then, yes, it's really interesting, but it's not really what I'm doing, but you should try this other person. And then I bounced around a few professors talking about evolutionary psychiatry, and basically no one was doing it. So I decided that I would just I would just go off and kind of do it myself. I had the joy of the internet. And I spent, in the end, I thought it would take 6 months, but it took about 4 years. The book that I was writing then, The Specialised Mind, which will be published in 2027, so it will actually have been 11 years, not 6 months, from start to finish. That was what I kind of started working on. And so then after that, I spent a lot of time thinking about these things, familiarizing myself with a lot of the fields. I think one of the reasons why it's so understudied is because it's so interdisciplinary by nature. You have to kind of know something about psychiatry, but something about anthropology, evolutionary biology, psychology. And so academia has been very bad at like allowing people to be truly interdisciplinary in the way that you kind of need to be if you're going to grapple with some of this stuff. And I think that's also why a lot of clinical psychologists and psychiatrists maybe a little bit reluctant, or just like it's slow to take it up. Because there's just it's this other whole huge field of biology and anthropology, and even most anthropologists don't know all of the evolutionary theory and stuff. So one of the things I think we have to do as a field is really build better resources to introduce people. So my trajectory was basically spending a few years getting really deep into it, and then coming out and kind of thinking, okay, I had a manuscript which was actually I would end up turning into my PhD, and I reached out to the Institute of Evolutionary Medicine in Zurich, which is one of the first, I think still the only true dedicated institute for evolutionary medicine in the world. And I found a really interesting group there, which was, an evolutionary anthropologist who worked with tribes, but also had worked with primates, was there, Adrian Yagi, who's my supervisor. And he had a really nice broad range of expertise, which was very relevant. And I was lucky enough to work with an excellent evolutionary biologist, Jordan Martin, and developmental psychologist there. So we had a really nice mix of disciplines. to really get into the details and hone some of the complexities in the theory. The field has been growing a lot, I think. I mean, you see more and more people get interested. The YouTube channel, which hosts the EPSIG UK, the Evolutionary Psychiatry Special Interest Group of the Royal College of Psychiatrists, is a bit of a mouthful, honestly, but that YouTube is getting, is growing. I think I just, with some other colleagues in the UK, set up a foundation, a charitable foundation to fund research in the field. But I'm glad, especially I found psychotherapists and people who are maybe less biologically inclined in the first place are very open to the idea that, it's, the environmental problems are something to do with it. And I also think, I mean, you've talked to Randolph Nesse on this podcast, but I think that when he was trying to build the field in the sort of, 80s and 90s and thousands, I think he was pushing against a much stronger force, which just assumed that we would actually find the biological breakage. There was so much hope in neuroscience and genetics to kind of really discover the pathology that I think, as much good work as he did, I think it was partly falling on deaf ears. But I think everyone kind of knows now that psychiatry is in a bit of a mess, that these disorders are not as clean-cut as we make them out to be, especially with this sort of maybe diagnostic expansion in the last 5-10 years. It's becoming more and more obvious that these are sort of more normal or sort of healthy-ish traits which might cause suffering, and we are interpreting within a psychiatric framework, maybe inappropriately, maybe appropriately. It depends on where you stand on the kind of role of psychiatry as to whether we should be trying to medicalize healthy human emotions. It's a hard thing. I think Randy talks about this as well. Say that you have a depressive state that's reacting to your divorce and job loss and abuse and everything, and okay, you're depressed. And we say, okay, well, this is, a natural response to being, having this status loss and needing to kind of avoid life. But at the same time, what are you going to do about it? And maybe a drug will help.
Maybe a drug would help, but then also, and this is something I talked about actually in the podcast I just released last week, which was about how to be less cynical as a mental health professional. All of those problems you mentioned also imply potential paths forward. So if losing a job or a divorce or financial problems or, lifestyle related issues all lead to depression, then by the same token, starting to work on those problems, albeit slowly and consistently, is a path for improvement. And yeah, drugs can be useful in that process. But I find it's all about how you frame it. And if you frame it to the patient that you have a problem that's multifactorial, lots of different factors are leading to this problem, and therefore here's a menu of options and let's pick which ones are the right for you. That's a totally different paradigm, I think, to the paradigm that a lot of psychiatrists unfortunately do practice in.
Right. I mean, a drug makes sense so long as it's not preventing you fixing the problem. My colleague, Paul Sir John Smith, always makes the example of, if you have a broken leg, you would take a painkiller, but you wouldn't ignore the fact you've got a broken leg. You'd want to kind of wrap it up and put it in a cast and not step on it. And so, drugs can be useful, and maybe even for the person who's going through, divorce and job loss, maybe the drug sort of helps them get through that a little bit. But so long as they realize that, it's a life problem that you're covering up a little bit, and you're covering the pain, or you're helping get through it. But you will eventually have to fix the ultimate cause, which is the environmental factor. But yes, it's a nuanced discussion. And I mean, I think you've just hit on something which I'm really passionate about, and actually my research in Cambridge is focused on, which is reframing the problem. I think so much comes downstream of the explanation and how we frame the problem in loads of subtle ways. Kind of, it's hard to test. We will test it, and we try and pin down some effect size that you can get by introducing an evolutionary explanation to someone in a particular context, and hoping to show that it's destigmatizing and encourages, optimism about recovery, or maybe alters what they decide to do in their life. If you take those depressed people who are coming to you and you give them the evolutionary explanation of depression, are they more likely to kind of try and fix the things in their life, rather than if you just kind of say, oh, it's a complex mix of genetic and environmental factors.
Right.
It doesn't really give you any sort of sense of purpose or direction. Mm-hmm. Right. one of the things that evolutionary psychiatry has to kind of deal with is this criticism that it's not actually going to help anyone. I think that, psychiatrists are so intent on, and, for good reason, and psychotherapists are intent on, the person comes into the clinic, I need to help them. That's if what you're telling me in the next 10 minutes is not going to lead to me actually be able to help my patients better, then I shouldn't need to listen to this. It's not relevant. A psychiatrist will wonder what's going to be different about this, 15-minute consultation. Now I have an evolutionary perspective, and how will it help my patients better? And at the moment, evolutionary psychiatry doesn't have anything that we can point to say, yes, look, this is how it will help. But I think we could do, and I think it could be in exactly the way that you suggest, which is just reframing the problem. If you just spend a few minutes talking about...
I honestly think it could help now, and you may or may not mention sort of evolutionary concepts explicitly. It might depend on who you're talking to. But I think having this understanding can help now, because you can frame it to the patient, hey, here are a bunch of basic human needs that we evolved to have. We evolved to have the need to socialize with people, have a lot of face-to-face contact, have deep, intimate relationships with people. We evolved to spend a lot of time outside. We evolved to exercise and move our bodies quite a lot. We evolved to solve problems. And this is something we can get into, people have different dispositions. So if I'm talking to someone with something like ADHD, particularly at the milder end, although there are disadvantages, there are also some advantages. So people with ADHD often tell me they're really good at hands-on stuff, like not so good at abstract written work, perhaps, although some are. But they often tell me when it comes to dynamic tasks that are very hands-on, something like a sport, that's where they excel. So there are strengths and weaknesses. Similarly, if you have something like emotional sensitivity, yes, that might predispose you to depression. It can also help you read a room better. It can help you maintain socially harmonious relationships better. So, it might sound perhaps a bit soft to a psychiatrist, but I think these ideas can open up a wealth of understanding both for clinician and patient. And then that wealth of understanding can lead to a lot of practical interventions that you can advise. So again, if you think someone with mild to moderate ADHD, maybe pick a job that suits your strengths rather than your weaknesses. For example, that could be a really good intervention, because if you have something like ADHD and you have a job that relies on you constantly delaying gratification, for instance, you're constantly swimming upstream, where if you have a job where you're constantly presented new, quite stimulating information and requires you to make quick decisions on the fly, that might be the best job for you. So I think even now it can help, maybe not in the most medical sense, but I think it can help our patients a lot.
Absolutely. And the example of ADHD is a really interesting one, because, on the one hand, the environment has changed so much, and we do need to, sit for 9 hours in a classroom and for, at least whilst it's kind of mandated by the government until you hit, 16 or 18. And then, and most jobs require some particular type of cognitive skill set, which maybe you're not naturally suited to. But on the other hand, entrepreneurs have a much higher prevalence of ADHD amongst them, and some of them report that, the quite impulsiveness, the hyperactivity really suits being an entrepreneur, because you're just kind of doing lots of things all the time, and you've got 20 different problems to solve, and so it doesn't really matter that you're flicking attention, and actually you can kind of hyper focus into your business and get a lot done. And maybe you're more creative, you see solutions where there aren't any that other people would see. Absolutely. And I think the reframing is super important. I mean, so when we get down to actually testing these how these explanations matter, we basically have to take groups of people and say, here's an evolutionary explanation. Now, what do you think of this person with ADHD? I mean, we might find some small effects. I'm optimistic we'll find some small effects. But I think if you imagine the world where evolutionary psychiatry is kind of accepted, and, people realize that, oh, well, there's these natural cognitive differences, some of them are, fit in better or worse to modern society. I think you just see so many subtle differences, like in the teacher who is responding to the ADHD kid in the classroom, and just has a little bit more empathy and doesn't kind of kind of like sigh and be like, oh, why can't you face the front? And I think that a lot of
make some sort of moral judgment, which is often what people with ADHD complain about, that either they make moral judgments about themselves, that they call themselves lazy or undisciplined, or that they constantly get that from the environment.
Exactly. I mean, it's amazing that any of them manage, frankly, because you kind of you're competent and you know that you can do things, but you're just not interested in sitting and looking at this board. You want to be outside and playing. And actually, it's natural. It's normal. It's really bizarre that any child can sit still for 8 hours and kind of follow all these rules. It's really novel. But at the moment, they treat it as if they're stupid. Same with dyslexia, of like you can't read. Reading is really a new thing. I mean, it's bizarre to kind of say to this 7% of people, oh, well, you're worse than, and you've got a deficit. And okay, it is a true deficit. It's an interesting example because it is such a disability to not be able to read. But the cognitive differences which underlie that, which might include something like interpretation of visual stimuli in a different way. There's some interesting experiments that show that dyslexics are somehow better at interpreting diffuse images. So basically, if you take a photograph of a cruise ship and you make it ever more blurry until it's just a few blobs, and then you de-blur it, dyslexics are somehow able to spot the cruise ship earlier when you're kind of taking this visual information and kind of making it make more sense or be more specific, which is sort of the opposite of like looking at fine little words, which are quite weird things. It's these tiny little details of lines up and down, and dyslexics often report that the words swim around the page a bit, or they can't kind of like focus on one bit at one time. But I think it's quite plausible that just having a different like visual search strategy would have been quite adaptive for hunter-gatherers. You're looking around the environment, you just need to find something quicker than others, or notice little differences which other people aren't picking up. That could actually be really useful. I think dyslexics also seem to have somewhat of a better visual memory and a better kind of visual spatial sort of logic or like ability. So if you there's been some tests with virtual reality rooms where you make a dyslexic put on a headset and walk around like a virtual environment and then map it out for you, and they have a much more precise idea of the space that was there and where everything was. So I think there's interesting benefits there. I actually know a dyslexic guy at uni who I didn't really know at uni was dyslexic, but he kind of revealed it to me later when he found out I was working on this stuff. But he noticed that he was really good at some things and really good at like comprehending some things that other people were really bad at, and did have this amazing memory. And actually one of his friends works for a design studio, and something like 80% or 90% of all of the employees were dyslexic. They kept around a couple of non-dyslexic people, basically as like spell checkers. But I have another friend who's a graphic designer who said, yeah, like half my colleagues are dyslexic, and they're just better at visualizing visual imagery stuff. And maybe it's just because they knew from an early age they weren't doing well with the writing stuff, so they just got really good at the art and the imagery stuff. Or maybe there is actually a kind of a cognitive strength there, which is more innate, which isn't just learned.
So I think this helps lead on to the next bit I'd like to talk about, which is this idea of specialized minds, obviously the subject of your book. So what makes humans different in this regard? Why do we specialize? If I think about another mammalian species, just giving a stupid example, like successful lions all seem to look the same. Like if you're stronger and faster and better at hunting prey, you're a more successful lion. Lions don't seem to specialize. Do we specialize? And if so, why do you think that is?
Yes, that's a really interesting point. So this goes back to a kind of long-standing debate in the animal personality literature as to whether animals showed different personalities at all. And for many decades, it was thought that they didn't really. But then in the 90s, people realized that, wait a minute, there are some slight differences, especially what is called the bold-shy continuum. So it's usually along whether you're kind of aggressive and outgoing and sort of a go-getting. And this you see this across all sorts of mammals, but also birds. There are birds who will fly further away from their nest to try and find food, and then some which are kind of shyer and will stay closer. But yes, you're right that like it doesn't seem to be the case that other animals have anything like the same sort of personality differences as humans do. So to explain this, the way that you have to explain any individual difference is basically by saying, okay, it's not, it's something which can't be good for everyone to have. So if there is like a trait which is useful for everyone, like, hunger, there's no one who shouldn't get hungry at all, or, falling in love or whatever. And okay, some people might feel variations around that, but actually, these are generally adaptive.
The vast majority have those.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. Right. So there are many things. Most of evolution is like pushing us towards the optimum phenotype, having two eyes which can see, getting hungry. And then you have this weird phenomenon of individual differences. And why would we have any individual differences at all? Why is everyone not extroverted, and no one's autistic, and no one's introverted? So the dynamics that often have to arise there they can be related to changes in the environment. And you see this often with, for instance, bird personalities, that certain types of environment where there's more or less food will be good or bad, depending on whether your personality, which will kind of leave further away from the nest. So you have what's called balancing selection. So most of natural selection is just pushing everyone towards having one thing. Balancing selection is, okay, there's times when it's good, there's times when it's bad. There's trade-offs. It's actually, often quite bad to be leaving further from the nest because your chicks might get eaten, or whatever, the eggs might be eaten, but actually you might find more food. So it depends on how many predators are around and how much food is around. And there's these complicated dynamics. The other major reason why we would have individual differences, which is why humans almost certainly have more individual differences than other animals. I mean, perhaps like eusocial insects are an interesting example. But the core factor is basically social groups, what we call social selection.
Is that the same as group selection?
It is not the same as group selection. Good point. So group selection, this goes back to like a classic argument in evolutionary biology about whether evolution should act for the good of the group, and whether being altruistic and helping your group survive would then kind of be selected for, and whether that explains altruism. That's a slightly different argument. It can relate a little bit, and it sort of does relate, because basically the answer is, you can be altruistic so long as you get some sort of benefit back from your group. So long as you're recognized as you're a hero, you put yourself in danger. Even if you do die, your children are alive and will provide for them and will keep them. And, they might end up, being honored and respected because their father sacrificed himself. You kind of need that as well. You can't have pure altruism, which is just like completely self-sacrificing, because eventually those genes will just be selected out. But the interesting thing about human society and human psychology is that we're really good at noticing the people around us and noticing kind of what they're good at and what they're doing. It's the thing we love gossiping about. We love gossiping about, this person was a little bit mean, or they're really good at art, or whatever it is. Or we one of the main things we like gossiping about, apart from relationships, which is obviously also a critical part of, the thing that we need to gossip about, is to know who's with who, and, who's open perhaps for my own sort of dating and mating market. But we do also gossip about, people and what they're good at and what they're bad at. And, my supervisor is good in this way, but bad in this way, or whatever it is, my manager. This is exactly what you'd predict would lead to kind of adaptive individual differences, because basically you can reward people who are, the people who go out on the hunt and notice the tracks in the bush, which like other people didn't notice. If you were to take the dyslexic example, and that maybe, or ADHD, maybe like one of the hypotheses about what ADHD minds are good for is just because they're kind of so scattered, they might just notice little extra things in the environment that lead to opportunities. And when the hunt is done and everyone comes back and they, you're eating the animal, everyone's laughing, and you're like, oh, okay, this is great. We've got meat. Well done. And everyone repeats what happened during the hunt. And it's like, oh, then he saw the tracks, and then then I made the call, and then someone else took the shot. And so this is kind of one of the ways in which humans are so good at interacting and cooperating. We are like the ultimate cooperating kind of independent species, and it's because of that we basically have been so successful. So these are exactly the dynamics which are kind of required for the individual differences to evolve. The most traditional kind of game theory derived individual differences which would evolve are like cheating and cooperating. So this is probably the way that we can explain the psychopathy sort of spectrum, and also at its extreme might be called the disagreeableness continuum from personality science. When is it good to be a cheater versus being a cooperator? Well, it depends on, many factors, but one of the key factors is, are you being punished for being a cheater? And how good is the rest of society at noticing cheaters and kind of keeping them under control?
And could I add to that, how many cheaters are there present in society?
Exactly. Yes. Right.
Because that helps me understand. I was reading the papers that you authored, which you sent me. I'll link those. So those are papers around specialized minds and around autism and how this relates to evolutionary psychology. And there's this concept of negative frequency dependency, which I've come across for the first time. And correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that's the idea that the strength of a trait can be partly dependent on how frequent it is. So if there aren't that many psychopaths in the population, then the population at whole, they're not very paranoid about it. They're not super worried or anxious that there's a bunch of psychopaths. So if you're a psychopath in that context, you can be really successful because you can take advantage of a lot of people. It's a bit like that movie with Ricky Gervais, the invention of lying. So he's the only person in the world who can lie. Because he's the only person who can lie or realizes that lying can be a thing, he gets away with it.
Yes.
So the more psychopaths you have in the population, and I believe this has been studied, the more wary of psychopathy the population is, and then the more likely it is that any given psychopath will be rooted out. So have I got that right?
Right, exactly. Yes, negative frequency dependency is a super important and interesting dynamic. I think you can see it in so many places. And actually, there's been a really big study recently on animal personalities and basically finding that negative frequency dependency is actually super common. Basically because there are so many ways in which you can kind of win, but as soon as there are too many people doing the thing, then you stop winning. And it can happen in, as something as simple as like finding a particular food type. If you're a particular type of bird and you're kind of traveling around the environment, and you start looking for a particular type of berry, but everyone else is looking for that type of berry as well, then there's just going to be less of those berries. But if you kind of look for a different place for a different type of nut, then it's suddenly good. But then the more of you that are looking for that nut, then it changes, and you have this sort of frequency dependency. And this is one of the main explanations for why you would see individual variation persist. I mean, it also happens with jobs and, something as simple as...
Yeah, it reminds me of business.
Right.
Like starting a podcast in 2024.
Yeah.
Like starting a podcast is 2024 is way different, as I'm sure you and I are both aware of, than starting a podcast in 2010.
Yes, exactly. You have to find your niche,
different
right?
landscape, different levels of competition.
Exactly, yeah. You have to find your niche. You kind of, differentiate yourself. You're competing, right? And I mean, yeah, it's the same in business. The more people competing to provide a service, the harder it gets. Same in running a business. Like you just don't, you kind of carefully tailor who you employ to the needs of the business. And you don't need, as soon as you realize you have 5 receptionists, but we don't need 5 receptionists. We only need 1 receptionist. Then you just get rid of them. This is a kind of, it's a fundamental, basically, dynamic to kind of niches in general. And it's core, I think, to explaining why these individual differences would exist. The interesting anecdotal example from the autism literature, which I think kind of makes this very clear, is it's captured in this story of a reindeer herder from the Evenki in Siberia, who was studied by an anthropologist, Piers Vitebsky. And Piers went with these reindeer herders, and he lived with them for months. I think even perhaps over the many years he spent there, over the many years he was studying them, he kind of spent years there. And he noticed this very singular figure called Old Grandfather Nicotin. Old Grandfather Nicotin was weird because he was a reindeer herder and he was a very important figure in the community, but he didn't actually camp with everyone else and he didn't eat with everyone else. He was sort of off on his own in his tent, preferred his own space, but he was kind of talked about and revered despite not really socially interacting at all because he had this incredible memory for the reindeer. So if you type in, Evenki reindeer herder Siberia, you'll find pictures of these reindeer. And when I'm presenting this with a PowerPoint, I show a picture of 100 of these reindeer, and they look quite indistinct. I couldn't really pick one apart from the other. I mean, if I really tried, I might be able to pick them apart. But Old Grandfather could look at the herd of 2,600 reindeer and know instantly which one was which, and could tell you their parentage, could tell you their their medical history, like, oh, this one got caught in a fence 3 years ago. He was constantly observing them and noticing which ones were winning, which males specifically were winning in kind of mating conflicts. So which ones would kind of be mating this year or wouldn't be mating, which is really important because the Evenki need to eat some of the reindeer, and so the ones that they eat are the ones which are the males which won't reproduce anyway. And like for the Evenki, the reindeer are more than just this kind of interesting, this herd of reindeer who are kind of like our pets or whatever. They are your very survival. They were clothing, they were food, they were transport. Like the whole survival of the tribe depended on maintaining the reindeer herd. An old grandfather, every time they had to make any decision about whether they would be, which ones they would be eating and which ones they would be breeding and what they should do, they just go to him, even though he wasn't, socializing at all. He's basically like this encyclopedic knowledge of the herd. Like in the days before computers, where we can just write down everything, like you needed people to have this really deep, intense knowledge of, seasons and, depending on where you are, plants or animal movements and whatever it is. Having this encyclopedic knowledge would basically made him a super high status figure. And if you read the account, it's interesting because all the other young men are quite jealous. And like, because all the men are like, no, I know the reindeer. But actually everyone knows, like, no, then you don't know the reindeer as well as old grandfather Nicotin. So it's a really interesting example of what seems to kind of fit a couple of the classic autism criteria of sort of this obsessive behavioral kind of interest and also this social distancing, and yet also having extremely high status and reproducing and being provided for, and the fact he's not socially interacting doesn't matter at all because he's just doing his thing and he's incredibly valuable. Now, I think the reason why I thought of this when you were talking about negative frequency dependency, it's obvious why you don't really need 10 old grandfather Nicotins, because actually, like, having one person who is socially, disconnected and just knows everything about the reindeer is kind of enough. That's all you really need. And as soon as, if there were 5 people, say that old grandfather, he had kids, I don't know anything about his kids, but, say that they were more on the autism spectrum because it's a heritable condition, the chances are that some of them, the ones who were proved themselves as being, having similarly encyclopedic memories would do well, but like at some point, the social inability would become kind of too much of a cost. People do actually really want to, socialize and chat and banter. And so it's a good example of where you'd probably see this quite like strong negative frequency dependency. And that can extend to kind of a lot of the different traits which are related to kind of both personality and some mental disorders.
Right. So it sounds like human beings specialize because I think human beings seem to succeed or fail as a group much more than individuals, but also there's something about the adaptability of different individuals to different tasks which can make human beings hyper successful in a way that animals simply can't. Like, humans can go into these different environments and adapt, and people can split off into different niches, and that can give human beings a certain level of superiority. And then the other point I'd like to get to is this idea that every trait, whether it's like a personality trait or a trait with regards to your psychology or your mental health, is in fact a trade-off. So you look at old grandfather Nick, the trade is you lose some ability to socialize. What you get is this encyclopedic knowledge. And I talk about this when I lecture about personality. It's really important to understand every personality trait is a strength and a weakness at the same time. If you're really extroverted, that's amazing for developing lots of more superficial social connections quickly, but you are sacrificing depth. You're getting breadth and sacrificing depth. Similarly, if you're really, really hardworking, that means you're really good at delaying gratification. You're really good at prioritizing the future. That's a major predictor of life success if you're very conscientious. But you're not that fun at a party, actually. And people prefer hanging out with people who are much more present, focused. So if there's one idea, which maybe you can tell me what you think, but I'd like listeners to take home, is traits always present this trade-off, strengths and weaknesses. And maybe there's a question around how can we build a life for ourselves that capitalizes on our strength while minimizing the impact of our weakness or our disadvantage, something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. So Daniel Nettle has written the kind of most comprehensive book that I know of on personality from an evolutionary perspective, basically looking at, proposing or saying, I think it's called Personality, Why We Are the Way We Are, or something like that. And yes, absolutely. Trade-offs are everywhere. It's really hard. And they're sort of inevitable as part of kind of individual differences. If there weren't the trade-offs, then we would all just be extroverted. One of the interesting insights from sort of more anthropological research and from an evolutionary perspective on extroversion is that extroverts might be more likely to get into conflicts with others, especially a few extroverts kind of fighting to be the most extroverted. Social conflict can actually be really harmful in a world where people might end up getting into violent kind of altercations with each other. There's no rule of law. Life was quite different. I think one of the interesting additional points, although absolutely strengths and weaknesses are everywhere, and definitely need to, but also work on their strengths. And whether that is because of a dimension of, ADHD or autism spectrum, or it's just conscientiousness or extroversion, that I think that's the general advice, which is super important. And maybe there are ways in which employers and educators can do a better job of incorporating those individual differences. I think it's a shame that we are so bad at kind of adapting around those innate differences when there is so much to give. But then this does then to the point where, like, a lot of these differences, so for instance, neuroticism is associated with, it's basically bad. It's associated with so much suffering and anxiety.
Just for listeners, so
Yes.
neuroticism is part of the Big Five model of personality. I like to call it emotional sensitivity for marketing purposes, because I can't think of a less marketable name than neuroticism. But it's like, basically, neuroticism is how much emotion do you feel per unit stress. So person A loses their job, person B loses their job. They're going to feel different levels of stress depending on their levels of neuroticism.
Right. And it's neuroticism really does overlap with sort of anxiety scales and depression scales a lot. There's the people who come to you with, general anxiety disorder are probably somewhere neurotic. They're not likely to be have very low neuroticism. Neuroticism is very interesting because it's so obviously good to be kind of fearful in an evolutionary environment. Just being cautious, making sure everything's fine, and like looking around like, oh, don't go out too late, watch out for snakes. Are my children okay? I have, 7 children running around. Am I kind of making sure that they're actually not, stepping on snakes or eating poisonous berries or whatever it is? Neuroticism, obviously adaptive in a world where you have no safety measures at all. Everything is trying to kill you and eat you, and there's infection and whatever. There's an evolutionary mismatch, I think, partly because we've tried really hard to get rid of the harmful sides of society, where, it's, even though there are kind of strengths to being somewhat neurotic now, they're less impressive and useful than they were, a few thousand years ago. So, and it's hard. Like, there's definitely something to be gained. There's something to look at and say, oh, what's my neuroticism teaching me? What is my anxiety teaching me? But also recognizing that you're probably overreacting. It's life or death anymore. It should feel like it's life or death because at some point it was, like the emotions were there because of life and death situations, but it's not life or death anymore. And you have to, working out psychological techniques and maybe an extreme, medication to kind of deal with that is just, it's sort of your lot, and it's what you've got to work out how to do, and just not trust your instincts to be kind of seeking danger everywhere anymore. But all of our natures are kind of completely mismatched to our environments. And pleasure is, I think you did an episode, I kind of clicked through one of your episodes with someone working on video games. I think there's another side to neuroticism which is less noticed in psychiatry, because it's basically like pleasure and how enjoyment can actually end up being quite bad for you. I mean, it depends. I mean, drugs are the most obvious case for this, like you're just tricked into thinking that the thing is good and you just need to keep doing the drug. But yeah, I mean, in the same way that our fears are misaligned to what is actually dangerous in the modern environments, often our kind of pleasures and our desires are kind of misaligned to what will actually help us. Pleasure and desire and feeling good was always meant to be the signal of this is a good thing to do for your life. And in some cases, video games can be good to do. But if you do them at the extreme and you spend 10 hours a day and you don't get a real job, although obviously now you can make video games a job, but it's not, like the probability of that is low.
Yeah, I put out an article in The Guardian about this, which was basically about the danger of, in this case, modern conveniences, that evolution makes us incredibly vulnerable to conveniences because, my God, the evolutionary landscape was so inconvenient that if you stumbled upon anything convenient that could help you save energy, save time, rest, you're going to pounce on it. Now we have access to all of the conveniences at our fingertips, and in many ways super helpful. You wouldn't want washing machines or modern transportation or things like that to go away. But I basically posit in the article that we're now in an era of what you could call hyper convenience. Convenience that's not just helping us reach new heights, but is taking away our ability to delay gratification, taking our way to deal with our ability to deal with discomfort, and therefore very much diminishing our resilience and our ability to navigate through tough situations in life. I'm talking about people who might have a video game addiction or a social media addiction, which prevents them from, say, going out in the world and forming relationships, cases like that. So absolutely, as much as there are downsides to negative emotions, there can be downsides to positive emotions as well. And it's one of those things, once you see it, it's very difficult to unsee. Kind of makes you very wary of the modern world.
Yeah, I don't trust my I don't trust my instincts at all. It's so tempting for me to finish this interview and then just go and play video games for 5 hours. But I'm like, actually, I did want to read this book, which will be more useful and better for me. But it's less pleasurable. And yeah, I mean, obviously, this is the classic criticism of social media, is that it's very specifically designed to be kind of give you this pleasure response. But I think games are actually probably better designed to be so engaging. It's a hard thing to know what to do with because people aren't complaining about it. It's and you really, to know the harm, you have to kind of play out the counterfactual life where you weren't addicted to Call of Duty or whatever, and you did actually just spend time on your work. I say this as a kind of gamer who's had to kind of deal with the fact that I am probably gaming too much, and I've had to kind of bring in rules and regulations on myself.
I mean, I use a simple rule of thumb with this, which is that I'm basically kind of mistrustful of anything, especially if it's kind of on the artificial end of things, like a drug or a video game that gives you a lot of pleasure or comfort up front and then takes from behind. Like, yeah, the video game is super fun and seductive and interesting, but then after a few hours, you're left holding a controller and feeling kind of sweaty and uncomfortable. Same thing with eating a pizza. But then using the counter example, something like, I don't know, working on your business or studying or even going out and socializing, often uncomfortable at first few minutes, but then afterwards you feel like accomplished. You feel like you've done something. I think so in-person socializing might be the best example where many people can relate to being a little bit uncomfortable, especially if you're not drinking alcohol. But then after you formed a new connection or you feel really good. So my rule of thumb is something I call like the economics of discomfort. If it feels really comfortable at first and then after you've done it, it feels bad, then maybe don't do it so much. You can do it sometimes, that's all right, but maybe not so much. If something feels uncomfortable up front, but then is rewarding, the reward is amplified later, maybe that's more of a regular activity that can be part of your day, and that's really very much going against your instincts, as you said.
Absolutely. No, yeah, I think that's very wise. There is there is the sensation of achieving something in a video game which is so strict and clear, and it's like this ding ding ding, and it like, oh, something pops up on the screen and you get an extra medal, and you can see you're 85% of the way in there, and now you're 87% of the way, and you get so much feedback to kind of convince you that this is the right thing to do when you're there, and then you step up and you turn it off and you're like, oh God, what have I been doing? But yeah, real life is just not, I mean, there's no quantifiable, I mean, maybe it's a problem in modernity as well, that our work is just so disconnected. Like the daily work for a hunter-gatherer is just getting up and killing the thing and bringing it back home and then being able to eat it, and there's just so much pleasure all the way there. I mean, because our body and brain were designed by evolution over millions of years to really find that enjoyable. And yeah, the problem of modernity is the problem of delayed gratification and having 10-year goals or 5-year goals, and if you can't tick off these little happy boxes, I don't know. I think there's maybe an argument where, like, the video game being kind of something which keeps you going a little bit, just giving you, because we have lost so much pleasure and so much, we've removed so much of these natural stimulations from our life, that I'm very sympathetic to using technology to somehow refill that gap, to kind of remove the evolutionary mismatch which might be caused by industrialization. But doing so in a healthy way is really the question, and understanding where you yourself as an individual, how much is healthy for you, and whether it's kind of dragging you in too much. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know. But it's a very hard line. I think, so many of these questions, the general evolutionary theory does apply to all sorts, to everyone. Everyone can understand themselves and their individual differences and their tendencies and their desires and their fears through the evolutionary framework. But the way it applies to you is really a very individual thing, and it will require you kind of understanding yourself and perhaps working with a therapist to kind of understand, how to best manifest it. And I do think that one of the things, to go back to your kind of earlier point, one of the things that an evolutionary perspective will add to therapy is just giving this extra kind of lens and helping to understand yourself in a way which maybe is quite rewarding and encourages people to engage in therapy more, encourages people to kind of to challenge themselves, especially in something where it's like removing the pleasure, like giving up a video game. The problem is, like, do you really want to? And like, you kind of know you should, but also your wants, your desires are much more aligned to no, I need to keep progressing in the game. And so, maybe like giving evolution argument will help some people kind of take that step to, restrict use, or, take a month off, or just try and restrict it to weekends, and see what happens. And as you kind of pointed out, like, I think that when you do engage in those behaviors, or, the restriction of those behaviors, or challenge yourself to overcome your fears, then you look back on the last month or the last week, and you're like, oh my God, that was actually much better. I should have been doing that. And then you can kind of we can kind of trick ourselves into feeling good about like how we're progressing. But, but making people take that step is maybe something the evolutionary perspective can help with.
And going even a bit deeper than that, you're interested in, your background is in philosophy, which is all about, what constitutes a good life, how can we live a good life, what is wisdom, moral questions. And I'm wondering, I think if you had to pick an area of science that could help us actually inform philosophy, I don't know if you could do much better than evolutionary psychology, because it helps us to understand why we have the mental software we have. Even the story you told at the beginning of the podcast about the woman whose husband left her, and then the groups kind of gets together and say, hey, this isn't right. There's almost, you can see in that story, an emerging sense of morality. I'm really interested in morality because I think it's something we've kind of tossed aside in a hyper-rational modern landscape. I'm interested perhaps in what form we can bring morality back, maybe get the best uses of morality without being moralistic. Do you think evolutionary psychology can help us to answer questions around morality and what it means to live a good life?
I think it definitely informs us somewhat. With most philosophers, I think, don't like this view, or definitely most ethicists. I remember actually confronting one of my professors. I say confronting; it was a conversation which turned into feeling like a confrontation, because she reacted quite badly to it. Because a lot of philosophers want ethics to be something that's kind of above and beyond science, and just part of. They want to keep that at least for philosophy alone.
Would you say above and beyond our biology as well?
Yeah, exactly. Well, I disagree that it's a useful way of framing it. But yeah, I think that depending on the person, then yeah, most of them are just not that interested. But I think in terms of practical ethics, you might say, or just recognizing how people can be moral, and because you can have your moral norms, which maybe are not constrained that much by evolutionary theory. And I think, in fact, a lot of the time you don't want to make the naturalistic fallacy of thinking that because, ADHD was benefit. Yeah, exactly. There is no sense in which evolutionary psychiatry is saying, okay, well, we shouldn't be treating this person who's in a terrible state just because it's an adaptive response. Like, no, you just need to help people as much as you can. That's the kind of overarching framework. But I think what it does lend more insight into how to do it well. So if you want people to kind of be enthusiastic about participating in a society where people care for each other and are, somewhat altruistic, recognizing human nature and kind of the environmental factors and the social factors which encourage that cooperation from an evolutionary perspective could just be a really, a simple way to do that. So, people often need, like, the people that they are cooperating with are also cooperating back. That there's a sort of mutualism there, that you're not just kind of giving to a sort of a cheating economy. One of the things I found most interesting about my 4 years in Switzerland, which I think is kind of downstream of Swiss democracy, which is very direct. All of the Swiss people vote 4 times a year on thousands of laws. And they feel, more than any place I've ever been, they feel really part of the government, because they really are the government, basically. The Swiss people are making the decision. And it's a sort of strange place to be, because it's very utopian. But it's not just utopian, it's like the fact that everyone is sort of going along with it. And I think part of that is just, and they kind of believe in the system. When I talked to my Swiss flatmate, she really did, she defended Swiss laws, she defended Swiss government, and which is very rare in the UK. All you do is complain about the government, because it feels like an us and them, and they have their own interests.
Sounds nice.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that somehow that form of democracy has kind of allowed them to feel more engaged in the system, and then also actually just be more ethical and be more moral and follow the laws in a way which we perhaps feel is like less kind of natural or less appealing in other countries where representative democracy is the norm. I mean, there are these little things. Just in terms of, if being ethical requires overcoming your innate nature to somewhat be selfish and lazy, and then I think that the evolutionary perspective does kind of give some little tips and tricks, perhaps. I think about this quite a lot, like ways in which you can encourage people to kind of to enjoy their job and also enjoy school, but I think mostly in terms of the workplace. Like, what are the simple things to make people feel kind of connected in a community at the workplace? And the evolutionary perspective can kind of lend something there, which is, the everyday and kind of regular activities of a hunter-gatherer group. For instance, sharing food together, like sharing food with people, and that food being kind of provided by the sort of work you're doing together is just such a natural part of being human. It's literally millions and millions of years of evolution. Almost the most fundamental thing that kept us cooperating was working together to catch food and share it.
And my understanding is that sharing food is actually very unique to humans. Is that right?
It depends. Primates do share food with their children. And I mean, if there's like a lot of food, there might be a sort of, the alpha gets in first and then lets others take it. We are the most food sharing for sure. But yeah, but I mean, we're also unusual because we have these kind of, we hunt large game, which then we can like bring back to the camp, and then we have rituals around it, and we party. Not that other like predators do hunt large game and then actually end up leaving the carcass, which sometimes then humans will scavenge. One of the hypotheses as to where we started eating meat was just kind of, following the lions along and just waiting till they've eaten their share and then taking it back. But I mean, just like simple things like sharing food, feeling like you're in a sort of egalitarian society where there's not like a strict hierarchy and people are kind of abusing you for resources. We are naturally quite egalitarian. It's really the kind of modern work environment because of just the way that capitalism and businesses are set up. But like at least trying to kind of encourage people to feel part of a community again, I think is something that we've lost in the last, especially even in the last 20 years since it became kind of normal to switch jobs so much. Even, I think the loss of religion was one core place where we lost kind of our local community and a local people that we could rely on at the church and find for mates and for social support. But then even after that, it was much more common to join a company and then work with them for 50 years and then retire. And part of that, and that was a more communal. I think there's more opportunity to build a community spirit in that environment. Yeah, I think that like the world has gone ever less. It's become much more focused on productivity and optimizing, but it is at the expense of an environment which is naturally engaging and which could also encourage good behavior and kind behavior and actually just happiness as well. I don't think that morality and ethics need to contrast with the kind of pursuit of happiness for oneself and for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, even connecting to points we raised earlier in the podcast, I even think discovering your, like, becoming more aware of your traits, by which I mean your strengths and your weaknesses, and then developing your strengths and developing your potential may even be a moral act to do that, because in doing so
Absolutely.
and discovering and developing your strengths, almost inevitably maybe excluding the psychopaths in the audience.
Lots of them, yeah.
Yeah, mostly my audience is mostly psychopaths. You know who you are. And by developing your strengths, for most people, you're developing something that can be tremendously useful to other people. If you can become a really great engineer, say, or a really great doctor, or a really great philosopher, whatever it is, that's something that you can then contribute to the group. You're going to enjoy it because it being your natural disposition, it's going to be something that you're in all likelihood inclined to do. And then the other people are going to get value from it. So it's like a natural win-win relationship. Whereas actually hiding from your own potential, you could say on some level, and this is not like a judgment thing, but you could say that's kind of immoral because you're hiding something that could benefit you and the other people. I should say, highlight, this is my own personal philosophy, but that's a little bit how I think about it.
I think you've hit on something there. And also I think that it's possible that using that sort of social worth argument could be one way to actually convince people to work harder on it. Because if it's just yourself, we are highly social creatures. We do want to be helpful. We do want to be respected and provide. And, it's a problem that a lot of people face is that they're actually not providing enough and they're worthless. And I do think that maybe emphasizing that it's not just for you that we want to kind of overcome this state of depression and like find your strengths and kind of get you back on your feet, but actually it will be really helpful to other people. I think people will respond to that. The question as to like what will best motivate you to act the good life. We probably do overlook the usefulness of just social influence, like, and not just from, being respected and gaining social status for kind of social way, but just because you want to be useful. And it's cool to be helpful. And one of the things that has really encouraged me, and in fact, frankly, the only thing that like keeps me working in this field is like, I do actually think it will be useful to people. I wouldn't be working on it. I wouldn't have been working on it for whatever, 8 years or whatever it is, unless I thought that someone will appreciate it and that it's meaningful. And I think you're probably the same. I think most people want that from their jobs, and and working out how to do that and to convince you of that is maybe that's also something that companies and maybe therapists need to think about, because so much of the time our job is completely disconnected. I mean, you run the podcast, right? You release the episode, but you don't actually see the impact. Like so many of our jobs are, you write the email, you create the product, you do the service, but you don't actually see the person who's enjoying it, or it's like, wow, that's really interesting. Occasionally they email you, which is always lovely. But we have no idea how beneficial our effects are of our work on the rest of the species. And if we were there and like seeing in their faces, I mean, it might get a bit overwhelming, frankly, if the thousands of people who are listening to you, if you think of the stadium that you'd fill with this podcast. But it doesn't feel like that at all. And we don't feel the same rush that we would feel if we were standing in front of 4,000 people. But we should,
And that's why I enjoy speaking live whenever I can. And it's also why I love being a therapist, because that's a profession where you really do see the impact.
Right.
You see the improvement week to week, and it's incredible. Maybe as we draw towards a close here, could you tell us a little bit about, what are the Where maybe is evolutionary psychiatry stuck at the moment, and what do you see as the future of the field? What's maybe exciting you about the future?
I'm very excited. In Cambridge at the moment, we have a really good team together of psychiatrists, anthropologists. We're kind of really trying to build the field. I'm seeing more and more people get interested. I have all sorts of young people who are interested in getting in the field. I think that I think that the need is there. And when I talk to people, just in a bar about the field, people are interested. I think
That's a good test, the bar test.
the bar test is actually great. It's one of the things that keeps me going. When you just say that what you're working on and people are like, oh yeah, this makes sense of my cousin or whatever. You're like, oh yeah, cool. So I think the couple of things are, we do need better evidence, especially anthropological evidence. And it's something that I'm working on is, finding out like exactly how is autism manifesting in its various, on different levels of the spectrum in hunter-gatherers. Can we find people with ADHD? Can we find people with depression? How's it resolving? This hasn't really been done well enough. There's a big opportunity now because so many societies are gradually industrializing. They're kind of running natural experiments, as we say, in, bringing in all these kind of weird, novel environments. And it'll be interesting to see if, people do just become more persistently depressed when they are living in an urban environment with, wage labor, in comparison to, 100 miles in the other direction where people have basically the same culture but are actually living an agricultural lifestyle. Do conditions like bipolar and schizophrenia manifest differently or just less in those agricultural communities? Is there something going on with that mismatch? I think there's so much evidence that we can gather that will be critical. And I would actually say, if anyone out there has $1 billion to fund research, the one thing that's so pressing about this to me is that there will never be another time to replay this experiment. You can fund the Large Hadron Collider, in the 90s or 2010 or 2100, and it's just a replicating experiment. We'll just be able to see it. But the humanity in its various stages of industrialization, it's already sort of going basically the natural lifestyle. But capturing this information right now, and even if we can't analyze it all right now, I think it's information, it's data that will be so important for as long as humanity exists. Whether if we exist in 1,000 years, we'll be looking back at this information on what were people living like. It's the true history of our species that we can try and capture. So I think it's so important for us to do as much as we can right now. That's one thing, and I am working with people to try and do that, and we will hopefully find people interested in funding the field who recognize that potential and the importance of this work. The other thing, which I talked about a little bit, is just proving where it matters, proving how it reframes people's perspectives on themselves. How does it affect parents or teachers? We actually ran a great workshop in Cambridge. We invited some young psychiatrists, trainee psychiatrists, to come and practice giving evolutionary explanations to actors. And we had a few stations, and there was, someone who was agoraphobic and another woman who was presenting as if she had a son with ADHD. And, the psychiatrists give these explanations to the person and to the actor, and they practice giving it so that, when they go back to their clinic, they can hopefully feel like they're a little bit more expert. The interesting thing that came out of that was that the actor who had a son with ADHD actually did have a son with ADHD. She wasn't really acting at all. I mean, she was being positive. But when we were talking to her afterwards, she said, this has been so interesting to me, and I am actually more, optimistic about Jack's success. One of the questions she asked was, okay, well, this is, so the environment is weird, and, school's not right for him, but like, how will he do when he grows up? When he goes into workplace? She was worried, she's worried, like, what's going to happen to my son when he's 18 or 19? Is it going to be this bad? And the evolutionary perspective just gave her a more optimistic view on what would happen. So yeah, I mean, just showing that this happens and finding out, who it's most important to communicate with, communicating this, just the fundamentals with these people, I think is one of the next stages for the field, as well as better empirical evidence and also better theory, which is another thing that my research focuses on. But yeah, there's a lot to do, but I think we have potential.
There's a lot to do. Yeah. Well, that's awesome. And I look forward to seeing where the field goes and look forward to following your work. So thank you so much for coming on today. We're going to have you back on at some point in the future, maybe once your book comes out.
I'd love to, when the book comes out, I'd love to. And yeah, we'll have done quite a bit of research here in the Cambridge group. Then some of our colleagues off to the Congo in a few weeks to run some of this research. So it'll be fun to share what they found. So yes, thank you for inviting me.
Awesome. Adam Hunt, thank you very much.